The tone was really tough. But if you listen to that last part, after we've accomplished border security, in his view, building the wall. A lot of people in Congress will say that will never happen, but in Donald Trump's view, building the wall, deporting the bad guys, as he puts it, the criminals, only then. So is he saying essentially in a second Trump term, or the president who comes after Donald Trump would deal with the 11 million? Is that what he's saying?
It's sort of hard to know precisely what he is saying about that 11 million, and that's an issue that has bedeviled not just him, but that was the key issue for the Senate Gang of Eight. But I think in speeches like this, it's not just what you say and what your actual policy is, but the tone of it, right? And that was a very ferocious speech. So even if there is a little wiggle room that maybe after he deports all the criminals and he sends a lot of people back and he builds this big, beautiful wall, that maybe then he would look at this group, that's not very reassuring to Hispanics, and that's not even very reassuring to some of these moderate Republicans who want to vote for him but don't want to feel like they're supporting a bigot.
And when you talk to the people inside the campaign, Dan, there were some this week who literally were saying, we won the election. This is, he's stuck here. We were worried he was going to shift. We were worried he's going to go soft. This will win the election. They believe, the Rust Belt states, the white working class, that this is what those voters want to hear.
I think they do. I mean, I think that they believe the combination of the trip to Mexico and the speech was a home run for them. Now, we'll wait and see on that. There were certainly some members of his Hispanic Advisory Committee who took a different view of what that speech was saying, and they were alarmed by the rhetoric of that. I don't know how you can be both hardline and softline at the same time, and I think that the issue for Donald Trump, and this goes beyond, frankly, the immigration issue, is exactly what does he believe? What does he stand for? What are his policies? I think he has been flexible enough, if you want to be charitable, or insincere enough if you don't want to be, that we don't really know where he stands on these issues. But Ashley's right. I mean, the tone of that speech, put aside the specifics of the rhetoric, the tone of that speech was very, very, very tough.
To the point that there's been a lot of reporting that the chairman of the Republican National Committee was prepared to issue praise of Trump, thinking he was going to get a more conciliatory or more open-armed speech, and then they decided in the end, never mind, and they were silent, dead silent, the National Party.
It wasn't just the RNC. I mean, there were a number of Republicans I spoke with, a number of prominent Hispanic Republicans who were looking for an opportunity to be able to get on board. They've had a fraught relationship with Trump, but they wanted a reason to support him. And I think when you look at this moment in the campaign, this is supposed to be the period where you are broadening your tent of supporters. And Donald Trump going out there, giving a hardline immigration speech, show me the voters that you add by doing something like that. We're talking about trying not to lose people in your base, but that's not how you win an election. You need to be broadening your support. You need to be building coalitions. And when you talk to Republicans, as I have over the last few days, are saying Trump is not doing that, and we're getting to the point where it may be too late for him to be able to do that successfully.
In the Clinton campaign, she put out a tweet. Hillary Clinton put out a tweet. Trump just failed his first foreign policy test. That was by his trip to Mexico. Diplomacy isn't as easy as it looks. And Tim Kaine went further. He said, Donald Trump went south of the border. He met with the Mexican president. Now, Trump says this was just, he's not the president yet. And he said this was just a get-to-know-you meeting. So that he says he did not bring up the issue of paying for the wall in the meeting. Tim Kaine says that's blinking.
He has been talking nonstop since the beginning of this campaign. We're going to build a wall. We're going to make Mexico pay for it. But when he sat down and he looked President Peña Nieto in the eye, he didn't have the guts to bring that up. He choked. He caved. He lost his confidence. He lost his will. He couldn't just be honest with that person.
That's their take. Now, Donald Trump says, I'm just meeting this guy for the first time. That's for a later date.
I mean, I think what really hurt Trump with that visit to Mexico was the moment when he was asked, did you bring up the wall? Did you ask Mexico to pay for it? And he said that it didn't come up. And then later, he was contradicted by the Mexican president. I think that was the moment that I think he opened himself up to being hurt politically by this, because it sort of played into the hand of the Clinton campaign, who've been saying for months that Donald Trump can't tell the truth and that he's unprepared to deal with diplomatic situations like the one that he found himself in. And I mean, I think this whole situation with immigration is a case of Trump's advisors believing that if he says the same thing, maybe in a more diplomatic way or a less freewheeling way, that it will come across differently to voters. That's very challenging because that's baked in. I mean, I think at this point, where he currently stands with Latino voters and with suburban voters is a product of the things that he has said over the last several months, and changing that is going to take more than just tone.
And yet, if you talk to the Trump campaign, they think just the photo of him standing there with the Mexican president, diplomatic stagecraft, that he would go south of the border, that he could stand there and have such a meeting. They think that we're in Washington, we're talking, we talk about this stuff nonstop. To the average voter out there, there's Donald Trump standing there looking like a president, looking like a head of state.
Well, the one thing I would say about that is for Trump, the bar is actually so low to appear presidential that just by sort of remaining fully upright next to the Mexican president and not offending huge swaths of the population earned him rave reviews. So just to jump ahead a little, I do think that will be a bit of a challenge for Hillary Clinton during the debate because the bar is so low. Again, if he can sort of stand there and not insult people and sort of present a baseline level of competency, that can be a great success for him.
And we'll see if he can do it in the debates. We'll see. We've never seen Trump in a one-on-one debate. But can he make the case, Dan, that the Democrats are too lenient on this? That a lot of voters out there do take offense that people who broke the law to enter the United States should just be able to stay, that you should have a path to citizenship. Trump makes the point that Democrats don't like to talk about their plans. Can he or will he make the case, maybe you think I'm too tough, but they're way too soft?
I think he can try to make that case. I think it's not an easy case to make beyond, as Sarah said, beyond the base that's already with him. I think that people who are not yet with him are looking for some more compassion on his part, some more generosity, some greater sense of a willingness to really reach out. And so far, we've seen that only in fits and starts.
And imagine that speech if there had been a rift during it in which he softened his tone, in which he said that, his heart breaks for people who have called this country home for a decade, and essentially laid out the same policy with the same wiggle room, but just spent a minute trying to say some of the other things he had said in the last couple of weeks and show a little bit of compassion for 11 million people who are here undocumented. Even if his plan is to send them all home or to leave open this window, that might have had a different effect. But none of that language that he sort of waffled on in the weeks leading up to that was anywhere in the speech.
Well, during the primaries, remember, Jeb Bush said that, and Donald Trump said he was the weakest candidate.